So today what we're going to do is we're going to take some time and look at two different accounts. The account of the 10 lepers and also the account of the woman who had the discharge of blood. We're going to look at these because I believe that there are some things that we tend to miss since we don't live in that time or place. So we're going to start with the 10 lepers, and we read about these guys in Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. And that reads, "On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance. And they lifted up their voices, saying, 'Jesus, Master, have mercy on us.' When he saw them, he said to them, 'Go and show yourselves to the priests.' And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus answered, 'Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?' And he said to him, 'Rise and go your way. Your faith has made you well.'" When we read this passage of Scripture, we normally talk about how Jesus healed the 10 lepers and only one of them came back to say thank you. There's nothing wrong with that, and it is what we see in Scripture, but our focus today is going to be a little bit different. Instead of focusing on their lives after they met Jesus, let's consider what it would have been like for the lepers before Jesus. We find the laws pertaining to leprosy in Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 through 59. Now, obviously, that's a pretty long reading, and so we don't have time to read the whole thing, but I am going to read verses 45 and 46 of Leviticus 14. "The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp." So a leper had to self-isolate. He had to cover his face, and he had to yell, "Unclean, unclean," everywhere he went, so that other people knew to keep their distance and not expose themselves to his disease. After that, there was a long process to being pronounced clean that you can read about in Leviticus 14. Now, interestingly, part of this process included the blood of a purification sacrifice being put on the right earlobe, thumb, and big toe of the person who was being cleansed, and that same ritual was performed when a priest was being consecrated for God's service. So here's the deal. If you think you might have leprosy, you had to go show yourself to the priest. The priest would examine the spots, and he would tell you to isolate for a week. A week goes by, and the priest comes to look again. Now, at this point, you might be able to start the cleansing rituals, but it's not very likely. What is likely is that you spend another 2 weeks living alone, and then the priest looks again. If he says that you're clean, you shave and you wash your clothes, and then you go back into town. But once you're back in town, you have to wait another week before you can go back home and stay in your own tent. 1 more week goes by, and the priest comes and examines you a final time, and then you're cleared to offer your sacrifices, shave off all of your hair, including your eyebrows, and go back home. After all of that, you go and offer the sacrifices and are pronounced clean. Whew, that was a lot of work. Oh yeah, and if at any point throughout that process the priest realizes that you're not getting better, you start over. For the family of the leper, you hope it's the mom who gets leprosy and that she has daughters who can look after the house throughout all of that, because anybody who had leprosy could not work to provide for his family until he'd gone through the entire cleansing process. Maybe you'd get some families who would help out and support them in the meantime, but you were still without work for more than a month. Leprosy was a big deal. So when we see that these 10 men come to Jesus to ask him for healing, it's important that we understand their background to the best of our ability. Who knows how many times these lepers had shown themselves to the priests in hope of being pronounced clean again. That way they could go back to their jobs, their families, their homes. One side note, before we move on, the only leper who came back to say thank you was a Samaritan. So, if you missed lesson 8, there's a super subtle plug to go back and watch it. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the woman with the discharge of blood from Mark chapter 5, verses 24 through 34. Scripture says, "And he went with them, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I touch even his garments, I will be made well.' And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Okay, let's be real. Periods are miserable. It is no fun for the one enduring it, and usually no fun for those around the person who's enduring it. Now, can you imagine a never-ending period? I mean, this woman had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Imagine what it would be like to literally not remember a time where you weren't bleeding. On top of that, she was unclean for literally 12 years. We're going to go back to Exodus, but this time in chapter 15. Exodus 15, verses 19 through 30 read as follows. When a woman has a discharge, and the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be in her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. And everything on which she lies during her menstrual impurity shall be unclean. Everything also on which she sits shall be unclean. And whoever touches her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything on which she sits shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Whether it is the bed or anything on which she sits, when he touches it, he shall be unclean until the evening. And if any man lies with her, and her menstrual impurity comes upon him, he shall be unclean 7 days, and every bed on which he lies shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, all the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness. As in the days of her impurity, she shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies, all the days of her discharge, shall be to her as the bed of her impurity. And everything on which she sits shall be unclean, as in the uncleanness of her menstrual impurity. And whoever touches these things shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and be unclean until the evening. But if she is cleansed of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after that she shall be clean. And on the 8th day she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and bring them to the priest, to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the priest shall use one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for her unclean discharge. So, not only had this woman been unclean for 12 years, but so had any seat she sat on, any bed she'd lain on, and any person who touched her on any given day throughout that 12 years was unclean until the evening. Anyone who touched anything she had touched had to go take a bath and was unclean until the evening. For 12 years. Just think about what that would have been like. And then she sees Jesus. She knows that he can heal her if only she can get close enough. She touches the hem of his cloak, and immediately she feels the blood flow stop. She had to be experiencing so much joy at that time. And then she hears Jesus ask who touched him. I can only imagine that her heart just stopped cold. Imagine the terror of not knowing what someone with so much power was going to do in response to your actions. But when she was faced with 2 options, pretend it wasn't her and use the crowd to escape, or confess that it was her, she chooses the honest path. She said that it was her, and she fell at Jesus' feet, explaining that she knew if she could only get close enough to touch his garment, she would be made well. And he says that her faith is what made her well. Imagine the relief and the joy when she finally gets to begin purification after 12 years. Just 1 more week and everything could go back to normal. The people we've looked at today demonstrated incredible amounts of faith in the accounts we saw. They had no guarantees that Jesus would do what they were asking him to, yet they had enough belief in his power to ask anyway. We don't have the same opportunity to talk to Jesus face to face, but are we the same way in our prayers? And if we're not, why not? Do we demonstrate the same level of faith that these people did? I hope that you guys learned something this week, and I really hope it was interesting to you and beneficial to look deeper than what we normally go. So, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next week.